Mom, the wires are wet. It is going to happen again. I am scared. These chilling words were spoken by 4-year-old Tommy Kowalski in April 2019. His mother, Diane, thought her son was just afraid of thunder. But then Tommy said something that surprised his mother. I can hear the sound of static electricity. It was just like this in 1937. The hydrogen will ignite soon. Diane looked at her son. Tommy had never heard the word hydrogen before. They had never talked about chemistry. They hadn't watched documentaries about disasters. Tommy was 4 years old. Other children his age watched cartoons. But Tommy was watching the lightning from the window right now. Such sentences were illogical for a child his age. Tommy was talking about something that happened 82 years before he was born. What you are about to hear are real-life excerpts. Every detail has been documented by psychiatrists, aviation historians, and engineers researching the Hindenburg disaster. This is the story of a child who remembers dying in the sky. The Kowalski family lived in a modest farmhouse on Pine Street in the town of Lakehurst, New Jersey. Their lives were ordinary. There was nothing unusual about him. He had no psychological trauma. He had not been exposed to historical documentaries. The family didn't even have cable television. They only had Netflix and Disney+. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Diane was folding laundry in the living room while Tommy played with toy trucks on the carpet. The weather forecast had issued a storm warning. Around 3 o'clock, the sky darkened. The first clap of thunder caused Tommy to drop his truck. Diane expected her son to run to her during bad weather. But Tommy didn't move. He pressed his little hands to his ears and stared out the window. Then he started to say something. At first, Diane couldn't hear him, so she moved closer. The ropes are getting wet. We have to pull them in. We have to pull them in right now. Diane sat down next to him. Son, what ropes? What are you talking about? When Tommy turned to look at her, she saw the panic in his eyes. The landing ropes, Mom. They got wet in the rain. If they get wet, the static electricity won't go away. It stays in the fabric. It stays on the ship. Diane didn't know what to say. This was the first time she had ever encountered such a situation. Tommy had never used the word static before. Diane asked calmly, Tommy, where did you learn that word? He didn't answer her question. Instead, he grabbed his mother's arm. I just heard electricity. It was like when you touch a doorknob in winter and get zapped. But I heard it louder then. The hydrogen ignited. Diane slowly stood up. Her heart was beating very fast. When her husband Frank came home that evening, she told him everything. Frank laughed it off. He probably saw something on the internet. Kids can say strange things. But Diane wasn't convinced. At dinner, she asked Tommy again. Son, where did you hear about hydrogen? I didn't hear it, Mom. I was there when the ship caught fire. The room fell silent. Tommy continued in a low, calm voice. It was huge and silver. We were landing. The journey was almost over. Everyone was happy. But then the tail started to fall off. I felt it, just like everyone else. And someone shouted that the ropes were too wet, that we had to wait for the storm to pass. Then I heard the sound. Everything turned orange. Frank replied sarcastically, That is a very creative story, buddy. But Tommy hadn't finished his sentence. My name wasn't Tommy. My name was Otto Clemens. I was 14 years old. I had gone to America with my uncle. We were in the reading room when it happened. I tried to reach the window, but the fire was spreading too fast. Everything melted. Diane grabbed her phone and went to the bathroom. With trembling fingers, she typed the name into Google. What she found made her knees shake. Otto Clemens. He was a passenger on the Hindenburg. He died in the fire on May 6, 1937. He was 14 years old. He was traveling with his uncle, Friedrich Clemens. He was last seen in the reading room on the B deck. She returned to the kitchen. She showed Frank the screen. Frank stared at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at Tommy as if nothing had happened. Frank cleared his throat. Tommy, where did you hear that name? Tommy looked up. Because it was my name before I was Tommy. That night, Diane and Frank sat silently in the living room. Maybe it is just a coincidence. Maybe he heard the name somewhere. His brain made up a story. He said the ropes were wet. He said the static electricity couldn't discharge. Frank, Tommy is only 4 years old. How would he know what static electricity is? Diane couldn't sleep that night. At 2 in the morning, she was reading everything she could find about the Hindenburg disaster. The details were horrific. 36 people had died. The fire had destroyed all the Zeppelins in just 34 seconds. Witnesses described the smell of burning fabric and flesh. And there, in the digitized passenger list from the National Archives, she found that name again, Otto Clemens, 14 years old, German national, cabin B -19, died in the crash. That is what it said. The next morning, Diane called her sister in Philadelphia. Her sister recommended a child psychologist named Dr. Vernon Hastings, who had published articles on childhood trauma and false memory. Diane made an appointment for the following week. When they arrived at Dr. Hastings' office in Trenton, Tommy seemed completely normal. He played with the toys in the waiting room. He smiled at the receptionist. There was no sign of any problem. Dr. Hastings was an experienced doctor in his 60s. He had been working with children for over 30 years. He had seen imaginary friends, fantasy development, even rare cases of confabulation caused by media exposure. But he had never believed in reincarnation. He considered it fake. Dr. Hastings started with simple questions. Then Dr. Hastings changed the subject. "Tommy, your mother told me you mentioned a big ship. Can you tell me about it?" Tommy's expression changed. He was no longer smiling. He looked at his hands. It was called the Hindenburg, LZ-129. It was the largest airship ever built. It was longer than 3 football fields. Dr. Hastings looked at Diane. There was no way a 4-year-old child could know these details. "Did you say you were on that ship?" "My name was Otto. We left from Frankfurt. It took 2.5 days to cross the ocean. There was a dining room with real flowers on the tables, and there was a smoking room, but it was closed to prevent the hydrogen from igniting. We had to use special lighters that didn't produce sparks." Dr. Hastings wrote something in his notebook. He took out a folder containing printed photographs. "Tommy, I am going to show you some photos. Do you recognize any of them?" The first photo was of the Titanic. The second was of a modern Boeing 747. The third photograph was a black and white image of the flying Hindenburg. Tommy immediately reached out when he saw the photograph. "That is the ship." Dr. Hastings moved on to another photograph. "Do you recognize this?" "That is the promenade. The windows opened outward. That way you could look down. I used to stand there and watch the ocean." Dr. Hastings pulled out a map of the airship's interior layout. It was a technical diagram that a child couldn't understand. "Tommy, can you show me where the reading room was?" Tommy pointed without hesitation. He indicated a section on the B deck near the rear. Dr. Hastings checked his notes. It was correct. He asked a trick question. "So where was the engine room?" Tommy looked puzzled. There was no engine room inside the ship. The engines were in the gondolas. They were outside under the hull. Dr. Hastings was surprised. That was correct, too. The session lasted an hour. By the end of the session, Dr. Hastings had taken 6 pages of notes. When Diane asked for his assessment, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mrs. Kowalski, I don't know what to tell you. Either your son was exposed to incredibly detailed historical documents about the Hindenburg, or what?" asked Diane. "I need to consult with some colleagues. I'd like to schedule a follow-up session. With your permission, I'd also like to bring in a historian who specializes in airship technology." 2 weeks later, they returned to Dr. Hastings' office. This time, another man was waiting in the room. He introduced himself as Professor Eugene Daltrey from Princeton University. He had written 3 books on Zeppelin history. Professor Daltrey had brought his own photographs and questions. He asked Tommy about the crew. Tommy described Captain Max Pruss, the flight attendant who gave him chocolate, the cook who made potato soup. He asked questions about the mechanical aspects of the flight. Tommy explained how the gas cells worked, how ballast was released to control altitude, and how the crew had to constantly adjust to changes in atmospheric pressure. Professor Daltrey's hands trembled as he took notes. Then he asked the critical question. "Tommy, you said you heard a sound before the fire. Where exactly did you hear it?" Tommy closed his eyes as if trying to remember. It was in the tail section. The sound came from the back of the ship. During the descent, the cables fell first. They hit the wet ground. and I heard this buzzing sound. It sounded like electricity. It spread from the cables to the frame. I was in the reading room, but I could hear it behind the walls. Then someone shouted, and then the fire started in the tail, where the crackling sounds were coming from. Professor Daltrey put down his pen. He looked at Dr. Hastings, then at Diane. That was the fire-starting paint theory, or the static electricity discharge ignition theory. It hadn't been confirmed until 2013. A team of engineers proved that the wet lines could have transferred a static electricity charge from the ground to the airship's outer fabric. This fabric was coated with a compound containing aluminum dust. The spark must have ignited the hydrogen almost instantly. However, this research was published in a specialized aerospace engineering journal. It is not common knowledge. Most people still think it was sabotage or a spark from the engine. Diane felt the world spinning. So you are saying Tommy was right. He was correct about the technical details. Professor Daltrey slowly nodded. Not just right. He describes the exact sequence of events that modern engineers believe caused a disaster, and he describes it from the perspective of someone who was there. Dr. Hastings closed the file. Miss Kowalski, I think we should pursue this further. If Tommy really remembers his memories, there must be a way to verify them. He said he was in the B-19 cabin. He mentioned his uncle's name. There must be records, there must be belongings and documents. What do you suggest? Dr. Hastings took a deep breath. I suggest we go to Germany. You should visit the Zeppelin Museum in Friedrichshafen. They have a complete archive of the Hindenburg passenger records and salvaged artifacts. If Otto Clemens left anything behind, it will be there. Frank had been silent throughout the session. Now he spoke. You want us to fly to Germany because our 4-year-old son claims he died in a fire 80 years ago. Professor Daltrey looked him in the eye. Mr. Kowalski, I've spent my entire career studying airships. I've interviewed survivors. I've read all the investigation reports. I've examined every piece of evidence. It is impossible for your son to know the things he claims to know. But if there is a chance he has access to real memories, we need to find out how. And more importantly, we need to find out why. 3 months later, in July 2019, the Kowalski family boarded a Lufthansa flight to Munich. Tommy didn't speak during the flight. He watched the clouds from the window. As the plane began its descent, he turned to his mother and said, "It is safer now. They don't use hydrogen anymore." Diane held his hand and said nothing. The Zeppelin Museum was located in the old port building, a magnificent structure with white columns. Professor Daltrey was waiting for them at the entrance. He had arrived on a separate plane and had contacted the museum's chief archivist, Frau Keller, in advance. Passing through the museum's main exhibition hall, they walked past a full-scale replica of the Hindenburg's passenger compartments. Tommy stopped in front of the reconstruction of the reading room. He stood there for a long time, looking at the bookshelves, the small writing desks, the slanted windows. Then he whispered, "I was here, right here." Frau Keller led them down a corridor to the archives section. The room smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. The walls were lined with metal shelves. The shelves were filled with boxes, folders, and catalogued works. Frau Keller had already taken out Otto Clemens' file. She placed the file on the table. Inside was a passenger card, a copy of his ticket, and a black and white photograph. In the photograph, a young man with dark hair and serious eyes stood next to an older man in a suit. Diane's eyes filled with tears. Tommy climbed onto a chair to see the photograph. He stared at it for a long time. Then he pointed to the child. "That is me. That is my Uncle Friedrich." But there was something else in the file. It was a handwritten letter tucked inside a protective sleeve. Frau Keller explained that the letter had been recovered from the wreckage, partially burned but still legible. The letter was written in German. Otto had written it on the morning of May 6, just hours before the disaster. Professor Daltrey read the letter aloud. He translated as he read. The letter was addressed to Otto's mother in Germany. In it, Otto described the journey, the food, and his excitement at seeing America. And in the last paragraph, he wrote something that caused everyone in the room to fall silent. Professor Daltrey's voice trembled as he translated the last paragraph of Otto Clemens's letter. "Mother, I must tell you about a strange incident that happened this morning. We were preparing to land in a few hours. The crew said there was a storm over New Jersey. Captain Pruss wanted to delay our landing. However, the ground crew reported by radio that the weather would return to normal in the afternoon. Uncle Friedrich isn't worried, but I am worried. I had a terrible dream last night. I saw the lines getting wet from the rain, and when they touched the ground, I heard a crackling sound like lightning coming from the cables toward the ship. In my dream, the tail section caught fire first. Everything happened so fast that I couldn't escape. I woke up drenched in sweat. Uncle Friedrich laughed at me. He said I had too much imagination. But Mom, I can't shake this feeling. If anything happens to me, know that I love you and that I died seeing the country I always wanted to visit. Your son, Otto. Diane was shocked by what she heard. Tommy was looking at the letter, even though he couldn't read German. Dr. Hastings was the first to break the silence. He predicted this. Otto Clemens described the exact mechanism of the disaster hours before it happened. Professor Daltrey carefully placed the letter on the table. This letter was found in 1937. It had been sitting in this archive for 82 years. There is no way Tommy could have seen it. It was never published. It was never digitized. Until today, only a handful of researchers knew it existed. Frau Keller adjusted her glasses. There is something else. When I pulled out Otto's file this morning, I found a note. It said Otto carried a small diary with him during the flight. The diary was recovered from the wreckage. However, it was too damaged to be preserved. In 1938, they copied the readable parts before the paper completely deteriorated. The copy is waiting in our basement storage room. Would you like me to bring it? No one spoke. Finally, Diane answered yes. Frau Keller left the room. When Frau Keller returned, she was carrying a file marked with a reference number and the year 1938. Inside were 3 typewritten pages, yellowed with age. The transcription was in German. An English translation was pasted on the back. Diary transcription. Otto Clemens, passenger LZ-129. Hindenburg entry dated May 4, 1937. Uncle Friedrich says I am very worried, but I can't help it. Today, the officer on duty said we were carrying more hydrogen than usual due to the winds over the Atlantic. He said it was safe, that the gas cells were designed to prevent any leaks. But I knew hydrogen was the most flammable element. It had been said that a single spark could ignite it. Entry dated May 6, 1937, 11 a.m. This will be my last entry written on the Hindenburg. We have a few hours left before landing. The captain announced that weather conditions at Lakehurst are poor, so we are circling until the weather improves. I am writing this in the reading room. There is a window here that opens to the outside. I can see the ground below. Uncle Friedrich is waiting in the smoking room. I should join him. But first, I want to finish this writing. I want to write down my feelings. If I survive the landing, I will laugh at myself for being so afraid. But if I don't survive, I want someone to know that I felt this would happen. In my dream, I saw where the fire would start. Professor Daltrey stopped reading. It ends here. The rest of the page is burned. Dr. Hastings was gripping the edge of the table tightly. Otto Clemens knew exactly how he would die. He wrote this hours before it happened. How is that possible? No one could answer. Frau Keller spoke carefully. There is one more thing. It was found next to Otto's body. It wasn't burned because it was made of metal. She reached into the folder and took out a small photograph in a protective sleeve. The photograph showed a woman standing in front of a house. Written behind her in faded ink was, Mutti, Frankfurt, 1936. Tommy looked up. He saw the photo and stood up. He walked over to the table. He took the photo. Diane tried to stop him. Tommy held the photo carefully. He looked at the woman's face. Then he started to cry. I miss her. I never got to say goodbye. Is this real? Is all of this real? Frau Keller's voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. Mrs. Kowalski, I've been working in this archive for 23 years. I've seen many people searching for answers about the Hindenburg. Victims' families, historians, conspiracy theorists. But I've never seen anything like this. Your son described details that aren't found in any public records. The static discharge theory. The wet cables. The place where the fire started. And now there is Otto's letter and diary. Both predict the sequence of events. This could be the most complex coincidence in history. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Professor Daltrey slowly stood up. He walked over to where Frank was holding Tommy. He knelt down to the child's eye level. Tommy, can you tell me one more thing? In Otto's dream, in his memory, did you feel any pain? Tommy wiped his eyes. It happened so fast. The fire came through the wall. Then everything went white. I didn't feel any pain. Professor Daltrey shook his head. He looked at Diane and Frank. According to the autopsy reports, most of the victims didn't die from burns. They died from smoke inhalation or impact. The fire was so intense and spread so quickly that most people didn't suffer. Otto's body was found in the wreckage of the reading room. According to the coroner's report, he probably died seconds after the first explosion. Tommy looked at the photo once more. Then he carefully handed it back to Frau Keller. Can you keep it safe? Keep this for my mother. Frau Keller's eyes filled with tears. Okay, she said. I'll keep it in a safe place. I promise. That evening, they sat in a small restaurant overlooking Lake Constance. Tommy seemed back to his old self. He was laughing. He talked about the swans he had seen on the lake. Professor Daltrey also joined them for dinner. He remained silent throughout the meal. But finally he spoke. I must apologize. When Dr. Hastings first contacted me, I thought it was nonsense. I believe in evidence, peer review, the scientific method. I don't believe in things like reincarnation or past life memories, or I didn't. What I saw today proves it, real, documented, verifiable proof. Otto Clemens wrote about his own death before it happened, and 82 years later a 4-year-old boy in New Jersey remembered it. Dr. Hastings replied, Why does Tommy remember? Why Otto specifically, and why now? Professor Daltrey shook his head. I don't know, but I'll write it down with your permission, of course. This case must be documented, investigated. Diane looked at Tommy, who was painting the paper tablecloth brought by the waiter. Will this help him? Will it help Tommy? Professor Daltrey thought about it. I think Tommy is helping Otto. He is giving him a voice. He is completing his story. Otto died thousands of miles from home in fear and loneliness. But now, thanks to Tommy, people will know what he felt, what he saw, what he was trying to warn them about. Frank spoke for the first time in a long while. Do you think he'll remember this forever? Will Tommy carry these memories throughout his life? Dr. Hastings finally looked up. In most cases where past life memories are documented in childhood, these memories disappear by the age of 7 or 8. Children move on with their lives, they forget. But these memories change them. They mature faster. They understand things other children don't. He looked at Tommy. I think Tommy will be fine. I think he'll be more than fine. When Tommy turned 7, Otto Clemens' memories began to fade, just as Dr. Hastings had predicted. The nightmares about the fire ended. The panic he felt during the storm disappeared. Tommy stopped talking about the Hindenburg. Diane keeps a folder in her desk drawer. Inside are copies of Otto's letters, a transcript of the diary, and a photograph of Otto with his uncle. Professor Daltrey published his findings in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2020. The article was titled, A Probative Case Study of True Past Life Memories, the Hindenburg Connection. The article sparked debate in academic circles. However, it also opened new doors. Other families shared stories of their children remembering impossible things. Dr. Hastings formed a research group to examine these cases with scientific rigor. The Hindenburg case became the gold standard, with the most documentation, the most corroboration, and the most undeniable evidence. Tommy remembers his trip to Germany. He remembers the museum, the old letter, and the photograph. But these memories now feel distant. It is as if he didn't experience it himself, but saw it in a movie. When people ask him about it, they ask certain questions. Because Professor Daltrey's article made the family famous for a short time. Tommy now says he doesn't really remember Otto, but he remembers Otto being scared. He remembers Otto trying to warn people, and in the final seconds as the fire engulfed the reading room, he remembers Otto thinking about his mother. There are things in this world that science cannot yet explain. There are memories that transcend time. There is knowledge that emerges without being taught. There are children who look back and see things they should never have known. The Hindenburg disaster on May 6, 1937, killed 36 people. One of them was a 14-year-old boy named Otto Clemens, who predicted his own death in a letter to his mother. 82 years later, that child returned, just for a moment, long enough to tell his story. He wanted to finish what he started. He returned to tell the world that he heard the crackling, saw the fire coming, and tried to warn them. Tommy Kowalski gave voice to Otto Clemens. In return, Otto gave Tommy something very valuable. He gave him the knowledge that death is not the end, that love transcends time, and that some bonds are too strong to be broken by fire, fate, or the passage of years. Do you believe that Tommy truly carried Otto's memories, that a spirit could speak again after transcending decades? Or do you think it was a coincidence? That a child's imagination coincided with historical facts in a way we cannot explain? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the nature of consciousness, don't forget to follow us. Because the mysteries don't end here. There are more children with impossible memories. There are more families searching for answers. There is more evidence waiting to be uncovered. The next case is already waiting, and this case will shake you even more than this one. The Hindenburg burned in 34 seconds. But Otto Clemens' story has been going on for 87 years. Some truths refuse to die. Some voices refuse to be silenced. And some memories, defying all logic and reason, find their way home.